The police cruiser's red and blue lights painted Sarah's driveway in warning colors as Officer Martinez stepped out, his hand resting on his radio. Behind her pristine white shutters, Margaret Whitmore watched with satisfaction, clutching a stack of violation notices like weapons. But Sarah Chen wasn't backing down this time. Not when those innocent moving boxes in her garage would soon expose a corruption scandal that would destroy the most powerful HOA in the county forever. 24 hours later, Margaret Sarah Chen pulled her Honda Civic into the driveway of 1247 Maple Grove Lane, exhaustion weighing heavy on her shoulders after another 12-hour shift at the hospital. The late October sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Willowbrook Estates, where every blade of grass seemed to stand at attention and every mailbox gleamed with military precision. She'd been living in this upscale subdivision for exactly 3 months, and already she felt like a gazelle in a lion's den. The first sign of trouble came as she stepped out of her car. Margaret Whitmore, the HOA president, emerged from her house across the street like a general preparing for battle. At 62, Margaret carried herself with the rigid posture of someone who'd spent decades believing her opinion was law. Her silver hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her pearl necklace caught the dying light as she marched across the street, a manila folder clutched in her manicured hands. "Miss Chen," Margaret's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "We need to talk." Sarah's heart sank. 3 months, and she'd already received 4 violation notices. The first had been for her trash cans being visible from the street for 37 minutes past the designated pickup time. The second was for parking her car in the driveway instead of the garage while she unloaded groceries. The third had been for a mailbox being 2 degrees off the approved angle. "Mrs. Whitmore," Sarah said, forcing politeness into her voice. "I just got off a double shift. Can this wait until—" "No, it cannot." Margaret's eyes gleamed with predatory satisfaction. "I've been very patient with you, Ms. Chen, but your flagrant disregard for our community standards ends today." Sarah glanced toward her garage, where a neat stack of moving boxes sat against the far wall. She'd been slowly unpacking since moving in, working around her erratic schedule as a trauma nurse. The boxes contained her life, photo albums, books, kitchen supplies, and one particular box that held documents she'd been meaning to sort through from her late father's estate. "What violation are you talking about now?" Sarah asked, genuine confusion in her voice. Margaret opened her folder with theatrical precision. Section 4.2.7 of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions clearly states that no storage of any kind is permitted in garages that are visible from common areas. Your garage door was open for approximately 43 minutes this afternoon, and residents could clearly see multiple boxes stored within. Sarah stared at her. "You're giving me a violation for having boxes in my own garage." "The rules exist for a reason," Margaret replied, her voice taking on the tone of someone explaining basic arithmetic to a child. "Property values in Willowbrook Estates are maintained through strict adherence to our community standards. Every homeowner signed the CCRs when they purchased their property." "I was unpacking," Sarah said, her voice rising despite her efforts to remain calm. "I'm a nurse. I work 60 hours a week. I'm doing my best to—" "Your personal circumstances are irrelevant," Margaret cut her off. "The rules apply to everyone equally. You have 72 hours to remove all visible storage from your garage, or the HOA will be forced to take further action." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Sarah had heard whispers from other neighbors about Margaret's further actions. Legal fees that could bankrupt families, liens placed on properties, lives destroyed over infractions as minor as the wrong shade of beige on a mailbox post. "Mrs. Whitmore," Sarah said, trying a different approach. "I'm happy to move the boxes. But surely you can understand that I'm still settling in. I bought this house because I wanted to be part of a community, not because I wanted to live under a microscope." Margaret's smile was sharp as a blade. "Then perhaps you should have chosen a different neighborhood, Ms. Chen. One more suited to your lifestyle." The way she said lifestyle made Sarah's blood run cold. There was something else in Margaret's tone, something that spoke of deeper prejudices and assumptions. What exactly do you mean by that? Sarah asked quietly. I mean that Willowbrook Estates has a certain character, Margaret replied, her voice dripping with false sweetness. We are a family-oriented community with traditional values. Some people simply don't fit in. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She dealt with subtle racism throughout her medical career, but this was different. This was personal. This was someone attacking her right to exist in the home she'd worked 2 jobs to afford. I see, Sarah said, her voice deadly calm. And you've decided that I don't fit in. I've decided that you don't respect our community standards, Margaret replied. But it's not too late to change. Remove the boxes, follow the rules, and we can put this unpleasantness behind us. Sarah looked at Margaret's smug face and felt something shift inside her chest. She'd spent her entire career saving lives, working weekends and holidays, sacrificing her own comfort for the good of others. She'd bought this house with money saved from years of living in a cramped apartment, dreaming of a place where she could finally rest. No, Sarah said quietly. Margaret blinked, clearly not expecting resistance. Excuse me. I said no. Sarah's voice grew stronger. I won't be removing anything from my garage. Those boxes contain my personal belongings and I have every right to store them in my own home. Margaret's face flushed red. Miss Chen, I don't think you understand the gravity of your situation. The HOA has legal authority to, the HOA has the authority granted to it by the homeowners, Sarah interrupted. And as a homeowner, I have rights too. If you want to play hardball, Mrs. Whitmore, then let's play. For a moment, Margaret looked genuinely shocked. Then her expression hardened into something cruel and determined. Very well, she said, pulling out her phone. Don't say I didn't warn you. Sarah watched in disbelief as Margaret dialed 911. Yes, I'd like to report a violation of municipal storage ordinances, Margaret said into the phone, her eyes never leaving Sarah's face. 1247, Maple Grove Lane. The resident is storing materials in violation of city code and has become belligerent when asked to comply. You're calling the police on me for having boxes in my garage. Sarah's voice carried across the quiet street, and she noticed curtains twitching in windows as neighbors began to watch the confrontation. Margaret ended the call and smiled. Sometimes people need to learn the hard way that actions have consequences. 20 minutes later, a police cruiser pulled up to Sarah's house. Officer Martinez stepped out, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and the bearing of someone who'd seen too much petty neighborhood drama. Evening, ladies, he said, his voice professional but weary. I understand there's some kind of dispute about storage violations. Margaret immediately launched into her prepared speech about community standards and property values, waving her folder of documents like evidence in a murder trial. Sarah stood quietly, watching the performance with growing amazement at the sheer audacity of it all. So let me get this straight, Officer Martinez said when Margaret finished. You called the police because she has moving boxes in her garage. Visible storage in violation of both HOA covenants and city ordinances, Margaret corrected primly. Officer Martinez looked at Sarah. How long have you lived here? 3 months, Sarah replied. I'm still unpacking. The officer nodded and walked toward the garage, peering inside. Sarah followed, acutely aware of Margaret's presence behind them like a storm cloud. These boxes bothering anyone? Officer Martinez asked, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer. They are unsightly, Margaret said quickly. They lower property values and create an atmosphere of, they are cardboard boxes, Officer Martinez interrupted. In a garage, which is where most people store things. Sarah felt a flicker of hope. Maybe sanity would prevail after all. But Margaret wasn't finished. Officer, I hope you're not suggesting that the law doesn't apply equally to all residents. The city has clear ordinances about, commercial storage and health hazards, Officer Martinez said firmly. Personal belongings in a private garage don't fall under those categories. Margaret's face turned an alarming shade of red. This is exactly the kind of selective enforcement that undermines the rule of law in our community. I demand to speak to your supervisor. "That's your right," Officer Martinez said. "But I'm not going to cite someone for having boxes in their garage. That's not what police are for." As the officer walked back to his car, Margaret turned to Sarah with an expression of pure fury. "This isn't over," she said, her voice low and venomous. "You have no idea what you've just started." Sarah watched Margaret storm back to her house, and for the first time since the confrontation began, she felt truly afraid. Not of the violation notices or the legal threats, but of the hatred she'd seen in Margaret's eye. The law office of Brennan and Associates occupied the third floor of a glass tower in downtown Clayton, its windows offering a commanding view of the county courthouse where Judge Richard Whitmore presided over his domain. Sarah sat across from Attorney David Brennan, watching him study the photographs of her father's inspection reports with the intensity of a chess master analyzing his opponent's next move. "This is extraordinary," Brennan said finally, setting down the last photo. At 45, he had the lean build of a runner and the sharp eyes of someone who'd spent 20 years fighting corporate bullies and corrupt officials. "Your father documented everything. Every violation, every attempt to enforce the code, every roadblock he encountered." Sarah leaned forward in her chair. "Can we use it?" "We can do more than use it," Brennan replied, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who'd just been handed a winning hand. "We can destroy them with it. But I need you to understand what you're getting into. Margaret Whitmore isn't just some petty HOA tyrant. She's connected to every power broker in this county. Her husband sits on the bench, her brother runs the building department, and her son is the deputy district attorney." "I know," Sarah said quietly. "I've been researching all night. The whole system is corrupt." Brennan nodded grimly. "The Whitmore family has been running this county like their personal kingdom for decades. They've destroyed families, bankrupted homeowners, and perverted justice to serve their own interests. But they've never faced someone with evidence like this." He tapped the photographs with his finger. "These documents prove that Margaret Whitmore has been living in a house with major code violations for 7 years. Violations that should have resulted in condemnation proceedings. Instead, they were covered up through official corruption." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "You're talking about bringing down more than just the HOA." "I'm talking about bringing down a criminal enterprise," Brennan said. "The question is, are you ready for war? Because that's what this will be." Before Sarah could answer, her phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at the screen and felt her blood turn to ice. The message was from an unknown number. "Drop your complaint against the HOA immediately or face the consequences. This is your only warning." Brennan noticed her expression. "What is it?" Sarah showed him the message. His face darkened as he read it. "They are scared," he said. "Good. Scared people make mistakes. Should I be worried?" Sarah asked. "You should be careful," Brennan replied. "But you shouldn't be intimidated. We are going to file a comprehensive lawsuit that will expose every corrupt deal, every covered-up violation, and every abuse of power. By the time we are finished, the Whitmore family will be facing criminal charges." 2 hours later, Sarah left the law office with a plan of action that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. Brennan would file the lawsuit within the week, but first they needed to gather more evidence. Sarah's father's documents were devastating, but they needed to build an airtight case. Her first stop was the county recorder's office, where she spent the afternoon pulling public records on every property in Willowbrook Estates. What she found made her stomach turn. Over the past decade, the HOA had placed liens on 17 different properties. In every case, the homeowners had been forced to sell their homes at a loss or face foreclosure. The properties had then been purchased by a shell company called Maple Grove Holdings, which had immediately resold them at market value. Sarah dug deeper into the corporate records and discovered that Maple Grove Holdings was owned by a trust. The beneficiaries of the trust were listed as Margaret Whitmore, Judge Richard Whitmore, and their son Michael Whitmore. The pattern was clear. The HOA would target homeowners with increasingly ridiculous violations, escalate the fines until the legal costs became unbearable, force the homeowners into bankruptcy, and then acquire their properties through the shell company. It was a systematic scheme to steal homes from vulnerable families. Sarah's hands shook as she photographed the documents. She'd stumbled onto something far worse than simple corruption. This was organized theft on a massive scale. Her phone rang as she was leaving the recorder's office. The caller ID showed her neighbor from 2 houses down, Mrs. Chen, no relation despite the shared name. Sarah, thank God, the elderly woman's voice was trembling. You need to get home right away. Something's happened. Sarah's heart lurched. What's wrong? It's your house. Someone broke in. Sarah drove home with her emergency flashes on, her mind racing through possibilities. Had the threatening text been more than just intimidation? Had someone tried to steal her father's documents? She pulled into her driveway to find 3 police cars parked in front of her house. Officer Martinez stood on her front porch, writing in a notepad. He looked up as she approached, his expression grim. Miss Chen, I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but your house was burglarized this afternoon. Sarah felt the world tilt on its axis. What was taken? That's what's strange, Officer Martinez said. As far as we can tell, nothing was taken. But someone went through your garage very thoroughly. All your boxes were opened and their contents scattered. Sarah's blood ran cold. They'd been looking for her father's documents. Did you leave any windows unlocked? Any doors open? Officer Martinez asked. No, Sarah said. I always lock everything. The point of entry was the back door. Professional job, they picked the lock without damaging it. No fingerprints that we can find. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. Sarah walked through her house, surveying the damage. The living room had been searched but not vandalized. The kitchen was untouched. But the garage looked like a tornado had hit it. Every box had been opened, their contents dumped on the floor. Photo albums, kitchen supplies, books, and clothes were scattered everywhere. But the searches had been systematic, they'd gone through everything methodically, looking for something specific. Sarah's heart hammered as she realized what they'd been looking for. Her father's inspection documents were safe in her car, but the burglars didn't know that. They'd torn apart her garage trying to find evidence that could destroy the Whitmore empire. Any idea what they might have been looking for? Officer Martinez asked. Sarah hesitated. She wanted to tell him everything, but she wasn't sure who she could trust. The Whitmore family had connections throughout the county government. For all she knew, Officer Martinez might be one of them. I can't think of anything, she said finally. Just personal belongings. After the police left, Sarah sat in her living room staring at the chaos in her garage. The break-in had been a clear message: drop the lawsuit or face escalation. But it had also proven something important: the Whitmores were desperate enough to commit felonies to protect their secrets. Her phone rang. David Brennan's name appeared on the screen. Sarah, I just heard about the break-in. Are you all right? I'm fine, she said. But they were looking for the documents. Where are they now? Safe. I have them with me. Good. This changes everything. The break-in proves they're running scared. It also gives us leverage. What do you mean? I mean we are going to accelerate our timeline. I'm filing the lawsuit tomorrow morning. And I'm also calling the FBI. Sarah felt a chill. The FBI. Sarah, what you've uncovered isn't just local corruption. It's federal crime. Mail fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, racketeering, this falls under RICO statutes. The Bureau has a task force that specializes in exactly this kind of organized corruption. That night, Sarah didn't sleep. She sat in her kitchen with the lights on, jumping at every sound. The break-in had shattered her sense of security, but it had also crystallized her resolve. The Whitmores had made this personal. At 3 a.m., her phone buzzed with another text from the unknown number: you're making a mistake you'll regret for the rest of your life. This is your last chance to walk away. Sarah stared at the message for a long moment. Then she typed back, bring it on. The next morning, Sarah called in sick to work again and met Brennan at the federal courthouse. FBI Special Agent Maria Santos was waiting for them, a sharp-eyed woman in her late 30s who looked like she could see through lies with X-ray vision. "Ms. Chen," Agent Santos said as they shook hands. "Mr. Brennan has briefed me on your situation. I have to say, this is one of the most comprehensive corruption schemes I've encountered at the local level. They spent 4 hours going through every document, every photograph, every piece of evidence." Agent Santos asked pointed questions about dates, names, and connections. By the end of the meeting, Sarah felt like she'd been through a deposition. "What happens now?" Sarah asked. "Now we open a federal investigation," Agent Santos said. "This is going to take time, probably months. But I want you to know that what you've brought us is incredibly valuable. The Whitmore family has been untouchable for decades. You may have just changed that." As they left the courthouse, Brennan put a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "You did the right thing. But you need to be prepared for retaliation. These people don't go down quietly." Sarah nodded, but she was thinking about something else. "David, I want to do more than just file a lawsuit. I want to expose them publicly. I want everyone to know what they've been doing." "That's dangerous," Brennan warned. "It could prejudice the case." "Maybe," Sarah said. "But it could also." The Channel 7 news van pulled up to Sarah's house at exactly 6 a.m., its satellite dish gleaming in the morning sun like a weapon aimed at the heart of Willowbrook Estates. Sarah watched from her kitchen window as Jessica Wu and her camera crew set up their equipment, transforming her quiet suburban street into a battlefield. Across the street, Margaret Whitmore's curtains twitched. The HOA president was watching, no doubt calculating her next move. But Sarah was done being reactive. Today, she would seize control of the narrative. Jessica Wu knocked on the door at 6:15, her cameraman and sound technician flanking her like bodyguards. In the harsh morning light, Jessica looked younger than her 32 years, but her eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who'd built her career on exposing corruption. "Are you ready for this?" Jessica asked as they set up in Sarah's living room. "Once this story airs, there's no going back." Sarah thought about the eviction papers on her kitchen table, about the 17 families who'd lost their homes, about her father's frustrated resignation letter. "I've been ready since Margaret Whitmore called the police over cardboard boxes." The interview began with the basics: Sarah's background as a trauma nurse, her decision to buy in Willowbrook Estates, her first encounters with the HOA. But as Sarah described the escalating violations and Margaret's obvious hostility, Jessica's questions grew sharper. "You're alleging that the HOA president engaged in harassment and discrimination," Jessica said. "That's a serious accusation." "It's a serious situation," Sarah replied. "But the harassment is just the tip of the iceberg. What I discovered in my father's papers is evidence of a criminal conspiracy that's been operating for decades." Sarah methodically laid out the evidence: the unpermitted renovations to Margaret's house, the systematic targeting of homeowners, the shell company that acquired foreclosed properties, the pattern of corruption that connected the HOA to the county court system. Jessica's eyes widened as Sarah described the scope of the scheme. "You're talking about organized theft on a massive scale." "I'm talking about 17 families who lost their homes to fabricated violations while the people who destroyed them got rich," Sarah said. "This isn't about homeowners association rules. This is about predators using the law as a weapon." After the interview, Jessica and her crew filmed exterior shots of Sarah's house, Margaret's house, and the meticulously maintained streets of Willowbrook Estates. To anyone watching, it looked like a perfect suburban community. But Sarah knew the truth: it was a carefully constructed prison where the inmates paid their own guards. The story would air on the evening news, but Sarah had other battles to fight. David Brennan had filed an emergency motion to stop the eviction proceedings, and Judge Harrison, one of the few judges in the county not connected to the Whitmore family, had agreed to hear arguments that afternoon. Sarah arrived at the courthouse to find it buzzing with activity. Word had leaked about the FBI investigation, and reporters were already circling like sharks sensing blood in the water. David Brennan met her at the entrance, his expression grim. "We have a problem," he said. "Judge Harrison recused himself this morning." The case has been reassigned to Judge Richard Whitmore. Sarah felt the world tilt. Margaret's husband? That's impossible. There's a clear conflict of interest. Apparently Judge Whitmore disagrees, Brennan said. He's claiming that since the case involves HOA regulations rather than criminal charges, there's no conflict. They entered the courtroom to find it packed with observers. Margaret Whitmore sat in the front row, flanked by her son Michael and a team of expensive attorneys. Her expression was one of smug satisfaction. She'd maneuvered the case into her husband's courtroom, where she was guaranteed to win. Judge Richard Whitmore took the bench with the bearing of a man who'd never questioned his own authority. At 65, he had silver hair and cold blue eyes that seemed to look right through people he considered beneath his notice. He glanced at Sarah with undisguised contempt before addressing the court. We are here to consider the defendant's motion to stay enforcement of a lawful HOA eviction notice, Judge Whitmore said. Mr. Brennan, you may present your arguments. Brennan stood and launched into a passionate defense of Sarah's rights, citing precedent and constitutional protections. But Sarah could see it was hopeless. Judge Whitmore's expression never changed, and he interrupted Brennan repeatedly with hostile questions. Your Honor, Brennan said finally, my client is the victim of a systematic campaign of harassment and discrimination. The HOA's actions are not about enforcing legitimate community standards, they are about driving out residents who don't fit the association's preferred demographic. That's a serious allegation, Mr. Brennan, Judge Whitmore said. Do you have evidence to support it? We do, Your Honor. Evidence that goes far beyond this single case. Sarah watched Margaret's face tighten with concern. This was the moment she'd been dreading, the moment her family's corruption would be exposed in open court. But Judge Whitmore cut Brennan off before he could continue. Mr. Brennan, this court is here to consider the validity of an HOA enforcement action, not to litigate conspiracy theories about county government. Do you have any evidence that the eviction notice itself is invalid? Your Honor, the pattern do you have evidence that the eviction notice is invalid? Judge Whitmore repeated, his voice sharp with authority. Sarah felt her heart sink. The judge was protecting his wife by limiting the scope of the hearing. No matter what evidence they presented, he would rule against them. The eviction notice was properly served according to the community covenants, Brennan admitted. However, the underlying violations were fabricated as part of a systematic campaign to motion denied, Judge Whitmore said, banging his gavel. The HOA acted within its legal authority. Ms. Chen has 30 days to comply with the eviction notice or face foreclosure proceedings. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Margaret Whitmore's smile was triumphant. But Sarah wasn't finished. She stood up, her voice carrying across the room. Your Honor, I have evidence that the plaintiff is living in a house with multiple unpermitted renovations in violation of county building codes. Evidence that those violations were covered up through official corruption. The courtroom fell silent. Judge Whitmore's face went pale, but his voice remained steady. Ms. Chen, you are not an attorney. You cannot address this court directly. Then let me address it through the media, Sarah said, her voice growing stronger. Let me tell the public about the unpermitted electrical work, the structural modifications, the safety violations that were overlooked because the right people were paid off. Judge Whitmore's gavel came down like a gunshot. Ms. Chen, you are in contempt of court. Bailiff, remove her from my courtroom. But Sarah was already walking toward the exit, her head held high. She'd accomplished what she'd come to do, she'd put the Whitmores on notice that their secrets were about to become public. As the bailiff followed her out, Sarah heard Margaret's voice behind her, you have no idea what you've just done to yourself. Sarah turned back, speaking loud enough for everyone in the courtroom to hear. I've just declared war on a family of criminals. And I'm going to win. The evening news began with Jessica was standing in front of the Willowbrook Estates entrance sign, her expression serious as she addressed the camera. Good evening. Tonight, Channel 7 News has uncovered evidence of a corruption scandal that reaches into the highest levels of county government. A scandal that may have cost dozens of families their homes while enriching a powerful political family. Sarah watched from her living room as the story unfolded. Jessica had done her homework, she'd interviewed former residents who'd lost their homes, examined public records, and spoken with federal investigators. The picture that emerged was damning. The story included Sarah's interview, where she calmly and methodically laid out the evidence against the Whitmore family. But it also included something Sarah hadn't expected: interviews with other victims. Robert Martinez, who'd lost his home 3 years ago over a supposedly unpermitted deck, spoke about the escalating fines and legal fees that had driven him to bankruptcy. Linda Thompson described how the HOA had targeted her family after she'd complained about discriminatory enforcement of the rules. One by one, the victims told their stories. And the pattern was always the same: escalating violations, crushing legal fees, foreclosure, and acquisition by Maple Grove Holdings. The story concluded with Jessica standing in front of the county courthouse. Federal investigators confirm they are looking into allegations of racketeering and corruption involving the Willowbrook Estates HOA and county officials. Judge Richard Whitmore, whose wife serves as HOA president, declined to comment. Sarah's phone started ringing before the story was over. The first call was from David Brennan. "Sarah, you need to see this," he said. Channel 7's website has been flooded with comments from people sharing similar stories. "We are not talking about 17 families anymore. We are talking about dozens, maybe hundreds of victims across multiple HOAs." The second call was from Agent Santos. "Ms. Chen, I need to ask you not to make any more public statements until we've completed our investigation. What you did today was brave, but it may have compromised our case." The third call was from a number. The FBI field office in Clayton buzzed with activity at 7 a.m. on a crisp November morning. Sarah arrived to find Agent Santos coordinating with a team of federal prosecutors, their conference room walls covered with charts, photographs, and timelines that mapped out 7 years of systematic corruption. "Ms. Chen," Agent Santos said, looking up from a stack of financial records. "Perfect timing. We are about to execute search warrants on the Whitmore properties." Sarah's heart raced. "All of them?" "All of them," confirmed Assistant U.S. Attorney Patricia Vance, a sharp-faced woman in her 50s who'd built her career prosecuting white-collar criminals. Margaret and Richard Whitmore's residence, Michael Whitmore's law office, the HOA headquarters, and the offices of Maple Grove Holdings. "We are also freezing all associated bank accounts." Through the conference room window, Sarah could see black SUVs lined up in the parking lot, their engines running. Federal agents checked equipment and reviewed search protocols. After weeks of investigation, the hammer was finally falling. "What do you need from me?" Sarah asked. "We need you to be our guide," Agent Santos said. "You know this community better than anyone. You understand how they operated, who they targeted, how they covered their tracks." Sarah nodded, thinking about the dozens of victims who'd contacted her since the story broke. Each had a similar tale: escalating violations, crushing legal fees, and the systematic theft of their homes. But they also had something the Whitmores hadn't expected: the courage to speak up once they knew they weren't alone. At 8:15 a.m., the convoy of federal vehicles pulled into Willowbrook Estates like an invading army. Sarah rode in the lead SUV, with Agent Santos watching as perfectly manicured lawns and pristine driveways became the backdrop for the largest corruption bust in county history. The first stop was Margaret Whitmore's house at 1251 Maple Grove Lane. Sarah felt a grim satisfaction as federal agents knocked on the door of the same home her father had tried to shut down 7 years ago for code violations. Margaret answered the door in a silk bathrobe, her face instantly draining of color when she saw the federal badges. Behind her, Judge Richard Whitmore appeared in the hallway, his usual commanding presence replaced by the stunned expression of a man watching his world collapse. "Margaret Whitmore, we have a warrant to search these premises," Agent Santos announced, handing over the legal documents. "Please step aside." Sarah watched from the SUV as federal agents flooded into the house, carrying boxes of evidence and photographing everything. Margaret stood on her front lawn in her bathrobe, no longer the imperious HOA president who'd terrorized her neighbors. She looked small, vulnerable, and very much afraid. The search of Margaret's house took 4 hours. When the agents emerged, they carried dozens of boxes containing financial records, HOA documents, and correspondence that would help prosecutors build their case. But Sarah knew the real evidence was hidden in the walls themselves, the unpermitted electrical work, the structural modifications, the safety violations that had been covered up through corruption. The second search was at the HOA headquarters, a modest office building that had served as the command center for the Whitmores' criminal enterprise. Sarah had never been inside, but she'd imagined it as a fortress of bureaucratic power. In reality, it was a cramped suite of offices filled with filing cabinets and outdated computers. Agent Santos emerged from the building carrying a single manila folder. "Jackpot," she said, showing Sarah the contents. Complete records of every property acquisition, every foreclosure, every payment to county officials. They kept everything. Why would they document their own crimes? Sarah asked. Arrogance, Agent Santos replied. They never thought they'd get caught. They'd been operating with impunity for so long that they stopped being careful. The final search was the most dramatic. Michael Whitmore's law office occupied the top floor of a downtown high-rise, its windows offering a commanding view of the county courthouse where his father had perverted justice for decades. Federal agents arrested Michael as he tried to leave the building through a service entrance, his arms full of bankers' boxes he'd been attempting to destroy. Sarah watched the arrest from the street below, remembering the smugness in Margaret's voice when she'd threatened legal action. The Whitmore family had used the law as a weapon for so long that they'd forgotten it could also be used for justice. By evening, the scope of the investigation had become clear. Federal agents had seized over 200 boxes of evidence, frozen bank accounts containing $4.7 million in suspected proceeds from criminal activity, and arrested 3 county officials on charges ranging from bribery to conspiracy. Sarah returned home to find her street transformed. News vans lined Maple Grove Lane, reporters interviewed neighbors, and satellite trucks beamed the story to a national audience. The quiet suburban community that had once hidden its secrets behind manicured lawns was now the epicenter of a corruption scandal that reached into the highest levels of government. Her phone rang as she pulled into her driveway. David Brennan's voice was jubilant. "Sarah, you need to see the news. The state attorney general just announced that they are launching investigations into 37 different HOAs across the state. Your story has blown this wide open." Sarah turned on her television to find herself watching a press conference. Attorney General Rebecca Morrison stood at a podium flanked by FBI officials and state prosecutors, her expression grim as she addressed the cameras. Today's arrests represent the largest municipal corruption investigation in state history. Morrison announced. We have evidence of a criminal enterprise that systematically targeted homeowners, perverted the justice system, and stole millions of dollars in property through fraudulent legal proceedings. The Attorney General outlined the charges: racketeering, conspiracy, mail fraud, wire fraud, bribery, and money laundering. The Whitmore family faced potential prison sentences of 30 years or more if convicted on all counts. But it was Morrison's final statement that made Sarah's heart soar. We are also announcing the creation of a victim compensation fund to help families who lost their homes recover their losses. Justice delayed is not justice denied. Sarah turned off the television and sat in her quiet living room, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had been accomplished. 6 weeks ago, she'd been a trauma nurse trying to unpack boxes in peace. Now she was the catalyst for the largest corruption investigation in state history. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jessica Wu. "Sarah, I'm outside. Can we talk?" Sarah opened her front door to find Jessica standing on her porch, but the reporter's usual confident demeanor was replaced by something that looked like concern. "What's wrong?" Sarah asked. "We need to talk privately," Jessica said. "I have information about the Whitmores' next move." They sat in Sarah's kitchen, where Jessica pulled out her phone and played a recording of a phone conversation. "That's Margaret Whitmore talking to her attorney," Jessica explained. "My source in the prosecutor's office leaked this. Listen carefully." Margaret's voice came through the phone speaker, distorted but recognizable. "I don't care what it costs. Sarah. Chen destroyed my family. I want her destroyed in return. Find something we can use against her. Anything." Sarah felt her blood turn cold. "They are going after me personally." "Gets worse," Jessica said, fast-forwarding the recording. "Listen to this part." Margaret's voice continued, "She's a nurse, right? There have to be patient complaints, medication errors, something we can use to get her fired. If we can't put her in prison, we can at least ruin her career." Sarah stared at Jessica in horror. Even facing federal charges, Margaret was still trying to destroy the woman who'd exposed her crimes. "There's more," Jessica said grimly. "My source says the Whitmores have hired a private investigator to dig into your background. They are looking for anything they can use to discredit you." Sarah's hands shook as she processed the implications. She'd always been careful in her medical practice, but everyone made mistakes. Any error in judgment, any patient complaint, any negative performance review could be twisted into ammunition against her. "What should I do?" Sarah asked. "Fight back," Jessica said. "The Whitmores are cornered animals, and cornered animals are dangerous. But they are also desperate. Desperate people make mistakes." That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, thinking about Margaret's threats, about the private investigator digging through her past, about the possibility that her career could be destroyed even as justice was finally being served. But as dawn broke over Willowbrook Estates, Sarah realized something important. She wasn't afraid anymore. The Whitmores had used fear as their primary weapon for decades, terrorizing homeowners into submission through threats and intimidation. But fear only worked when people believed they were powerless. Sarah wasn't powerless. She had the FBI, the state attorney general, the media, and most importantly, she had the truth. Margaret could hire all the private investigators she wanted. But she couldn't change the facts. The evidence against the Whitmore family was overwhelming, and no amount of character assassination could alter that reality. Sarah got up and made coffee, then opened her laptop to check the news. The corruption scandal was the lead story on every major outlet. Editorial writers were calling for systemic reform of HOA. 6 months later, Sarah Chen stood in the witness box of Federal District Court, her right hand raised as she swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. The courtroom was packed with victims, reporters, and federal prosecutors who had worked tirelessly to bring the Whitmore criminal enterprise to justice. Judge Patricia Hawkins, specially assigned from outside the county to ensure impartiality, looked down at Sarah with the respect reserved for those who risk everything to expose corruption. At the prosecution table, Assistant U.S. Attorney Patricia Vance shuffled through documents that would finally close the book on one of the largest municipal corruption cases in American history. At the defense table, Richard Whitmore sat alone. His wife Margaret had already pleaded guilty and been sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. His son Michael was serving 12 years for his role in the conspiracy. The former judge's silver hair had turned completely white, and his once commanding presence had withered into the hollow shell of a man who'd lost everything. "Miss Chen," Patricia Vance began, "please tell the court how this case began." Sarah's voice was steady as she recounted the story that had captivated the nation. "It began with boxes, Your Honor. Moving boxes in my garage that Mrs. Whitmore decided violated HOA regulations. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the courtroom. The most powerful family in the county had been brought down by their obsession with controlling every detail of their neighbors' lives, including cardboard boxes in a private garage. And what did you discover when you investigated Mrs. Whitmore's complaints?" Vance continued. "I discovered that my father had documented extensive code violations in Mrs. Whitmore's own home," Sarah replied. "Violations that had been covered up through official corruption for 7 years. Sarah's testimony lasted 2 days. She methodically walked the jury through every piece of evidence, the unpermitted renovations, the systematic targeting of homeowners, the shell company that acquired foreclosed properties, the web of corruption that connected the HOA to the county court system. But it was Margaret Whitmore's testimony that delivered the killing blow. The former HOA president took the stand wearing an orange prison jumpsuit, her once perfect hair now gray and unkempt. Her voice shook as she described the criminal enterprise she'd helped build and maintain. "We identified homeowners who were vulnerable," Margaret testified, her eyes fixed on the floor. Single mothers, elderly residents, minorities, anyone who wouldn't have the resources to fight back legally. And then what would you do? Vance asked. We would target them with increasingly ridiculous violations, Margaret continued. Parking violations, mailbox angles, trash can timing, anything we could find. When they couldn't pay the escalating fines, we would place liens on their properties. What happened to those properties? Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. They were foreclosed and sold to Maple Grove Holdings, a company owned by my family. The jury listened in stunned silence as Margaret described how they'd stolen homes from 43 families over 7 years, generating over $8 million in illegal profits. She detailed the bribes paid to county officials, the falsified inspection reports, the legal proceedings manipulated by her husband's court. But it was her description of their targeting criteria that sent shockwaves through the courtroom. We specifically looked for people who were different, Margaret admitted. People who didn't fit our vision of what Willowbrook Estates should be. We used the HOA rules as weapons to drive them out. The defense attorney, clearly struggling with an unwinnable case, attempted to portray his client as a victim of his wife's scheme. But the evidence was overwhelming. Financial records showed that Richard Whitmore had personally profited from every fraudulent foreclosure. Court transcripts revealed his consistent bias in favor of HOA legal actions. Witness testimony painted a picture of a judge who'd perverted justice for personal gain. The trial lasted 3 weeks. When it was over, Richard Whitmore was convicted on 14 federal charges including racketeering, conspiracy, mail fraud, and bribery. Judge Hawkins sentenced him to 25 years in federal prison, effectively a life sentence for the 70-year-old former judge. But the criminal trials were only the beginning of the Whitmore's downfall. Sarah stood outside the federal courthouse on a bright April morning, watching as workers removed the Willowbrook Estates sign that had marked the entrance to the community for 15 years. The HOA had been dissolved by court order, its assets liquidated to pay victim compensation. David Brennan stood beside her, holding a thick folder of legal documents. It's official, he said. The last property has been returned to its rightful owners. Every family that lost their home is getting it back or receiving full compensation. Sarah nodded, thinking about Robert Martinez, who was moving back into his house next week. Linda Thompson, who'd used her compensation to buy a larger home in a different neighborhood. The 41 other families who'd finally received justice after years of suffering. What about the Whitmore properties? Sarah asked. Brennan smiled grimly. Margaret's house is being demolished. The unpermitted renovations made it structurally unsafe. Your father was right 7 years ago. The property will be turned into a community park. Sarah felt a deep satisfaction at the poetic justice. The house that had started her father's fight against corruption would become a symbol of transparency and community healing. There's something else, Brennan continued. The state legislature passed the Homeowner Protection Act last week. It's being called the Sarah Chen Law. Sarah looked at him in surprise. What does it do? It creates oversight mechanisms for HOAs, establishes appeal processes for violations, and makes it illegal to use association rules for discriminatory purposes. It also requires that all HOA board members undergo training on fair housing laws. The legislation had been inspired by Sarah's case, but it represented something larger, a recognition that the power imbalances in planned communities needed to be addressed through systemic reform. Jessica Wu approached them, her camera crew capturing the moment for the evening news. Over the past 6 months, Jessica had won a Pulitzer Prize for her coverage of the corruption scandal, but she'd never lost sight of the human story at its center. Sarah, how does it feel to see this finally resolved? Jessica asked. Sarah considered the question carefully. It feels like justice, she said. Not just for me, but for every family that was targeted, every homeowner who was intimidated. Every person who was told they didn't belong in their own community. That evening, Sarah sat in her living room watching the news coverage of the case's conclusion. The story had become a national symbol of how ordinary citizens could fight back against institutional corruption and win. But for Sarah, the real victory wasn't the headlines or the awards or even the prison sentences. It was the letter she'd received that morning from a young family in Ohio who'd used her story as inspiration to fight their own corrupt HOA. It was the calls from homeowners across the country who'd found the courage to speak up after seeing what was possible. Her phone rang. Agent Santos was calling with final news about the investigation. "Sarah, I wanted you to be the first to know. The Justice Department is launching a national task force to investigate HOA corruption. They are using the Whitmore case as a model for similar investigations in 12 other states." Sarah smiled. The impact of her fight was spreading far beyond Willowbrook Estates, beyond the county, beyond even the state. Corrupt HOAs across the country would now face federal scrutiny. "There's one more thing," Agent Santos continued. "The director wants to personally thank you. You'll be receiving the FBI's Public Service Award for your courage in exposing this corruption." After the call ended, Sarah walked to her garage, the same garage where this entire saga had begun. The boxes were long gone, their contents finally unpacked and put away. But she kept one item from that original storage, her father's inspection report on Margaret Whitmore's house. The document was framed now, hanging on her garage wall as a reminder that integrity matters, that speaking truth to power has consequences, and that sometimes the smallest acts of resistance can topple the mightiest dynasties. Margaret Whitmore had called the police over boxes in a garage, believing that her power and connections made her untouchable. She'd been wrong on both counts. The boxes had contained evidence that exposed a criminal enterprise spanning decades. And Margaret herself was now serving 8 years in federal prison, her power stripped away, her connections severed, her empire reduced to rubble. Sarah had learned something important during her battle with the Whitmores: corruption thrives in darkness, but it withers when exposed to light. The powerful stay powerful only when good people remain silent. And sometimes, the most effective weapon against injustice is simply the refusal to be intimidated. As she turned off the garage light and headed back to her house, Sarah thought about the 43 families who now had their homes back, the legislation that would protect future homeowners, and the national investigation that would root out corruption in communities across America. Margaret Whitmore had tried to destroy one woman over cardboard boxes. Instead, she'd awakened a movement that would protect thousands of families from predatory HOAs. The war